Updated oneself in Greek life. Late good evening, dear wanderers of history. I do hope you found a cozy spot, perhaps near a window where the streetlights flicker just enough to cast long shadows on the wall, or maybe in bed with that one lamp that somehow never quite burns out, no matter how hard you try to snuff it. If you're still awake tonight, whether by choice or because your brain refuses to let you sleep before midnight, then you've arrived at the right place. I'm Sleepy Historian, your guide through the twilight of ancient tales and the quiet corners where history lingers like an unopened letter on a desk. Now, before we begin, if you'd indulge me with a little favor, wherever you are in this world tonight, I'd love to know. Is it the hum of a city that never truly rests, or the crunch of autumn leaves underfoot where you've paused to listen? A comment is all it takes, and if you happen to be new here, well, I do appreciate the quiet support. You know, like leaving a like or subscribing so we can keep these late-night conversations going. But no pressure, of course. We're here to talk about something far more pressing, the age of brides at ancient Greek weddings. And yes, that means we'll be discussing how young these girls were when they left their father's house, often for the last time. Now, dim those lights if you haven't already. Let's set aside the glittering images of gods and heroes for a moment and peer into the less glamorous reality of marriage in classical Greece. It's not the sort of topic that usually gets us reaching for the dramatic reenactments or sweeping strings, but it is, I promise, fascinating once you pull back the curtain. And I do mean asterisk pull asterisk, because beneath those marble pillars and olive groves lies a world where the age of consent was less about romance and more about property, politics, and the relentless march of time. The Greeks, you see, were not the soft-hearted romantics we sometimes imagine them to be. Oh, they certainly had their poets spinning tales of love and destiny, but when it came to marriage, practicality ruled. A bride's age wasn't determined by whether her heart was ready for love or whether she'd finished her education. It was about her fertility, her value in the market, and sometimes her role in securing alliances between families. And let me tell you, those alliances could get rather strategic. Take, for example, the case of Nausicaa from Homer's Asterisk Odyssey. She's often painted as this idealized young woman, washing clothes by the sea with her handmaidens while waiting for Odysseus to wash up, literally. But here's a thought. If we're being honest about her age in the context of Greek marriage customs, she was probably already a bride in her own right, or at least on the cusp of it. The Greeks didn't dither over such things. By the time a girl hit puberty, roughly around 12 to 14 years old, she was fair game for marriage, provided her father agreed, and she hadn't already been promised off like some prized heifer at an auction. Now, I'm not suggesting that every ancient Greek bride was a child in the way we'd use the term today. The word child can be a slippery one when it comes to history, but let's just say that if you're marrying someone who hasn't yet grown into her full adult stature and whose voice is still changing, well, you're probably looking at a very young bride by modern standards, and the Greeks had no qualms about this. In fact, they rather prided themselves on it. A girl married too late, past 16 or so, was seen as something of an anomaly, almost a social blunder. Why wait when there were sons to be produced and heirs to be secured? Of course, this wasn't uniform across Greece. The customs varied by city-state, social class, and even the whims of individual families. In Athens, for instance, we see evidence that brides tended to marry in their early teens, often between 12 and 14. But then there were the more prosperous or politically connected families who might wait until a girl was closer to 15 or 16, especially if she was being married off to cement an alliance with another influential household. And let's not forget the rural areas, where life was harder and children had to be put to work sooner. Marriage there might happen even earlier, around 10 or 11, if only to get a young girl out of her father's house and into one where she could contribute labor. But that's where things get interesting. The Greeks didn't have a legal concept of age of consent in the way we do today. There was no law saying, You can't marry someone under 18. Instead, marriage was seen as a transaction between two fathers, one giving away his daughter or daughter-in-law, and the other taking her on. The girl herself had little say in the matter, unless she was particularly lucky or stubborn. And if she resisted, well, resistance was often met with force, not necessarily physical violence, but the kind that came from being told, quite bluntly, that her father's authority over her was absolute until the day he saw fit to marry her off. Now, I won't lie to you, this might sound harsh. But then again, so is life in a world where your value is tied to your ability to bear children and where your future husband isn't necessarily someone you've chosen for yourself, but rather the man your father has picked to advance his interests. And let's be clear, this wasn't unique to Greece. You'd find similar customs in Rome, in ancient Egypt, even in medieval Europe. The Greeks were not exceptional in this regard. They were, however, exceptional in how they wrote about it, how they poetized the pain of losing a daughter, how they mythologized the first marriages in their pantheon. Take the story of Hera and Zeus, for instance. Hera is often depicted as a jealous wife, but let's not forget that she was likely married off at a very young age to secure her father's alliance with Zeus' family. And what about Cassandra? She's famous for her curse, but she was also a priestess of Athena, hardly the life of a typical Greek bride. Yet even she was subject to the whims of marriage when Apollo took her, promising her prophetic gifts in return for her hand. Not exactly a fairy tale ending, is it? Then there's the case of Penelope from the Odyssey. We know her as the faithful wife waiting for Odysseus, but let's not romanticize her too much either. Penelope was no child bride. She was likely in her mid-20s when she married Odysseus, which, for its time, was downright scandalous by Greek standards. Most brides were younger, but Penelope's age might have been a point of pride for Homer, suggesting that she was the exception rather than the rule. But let's talk about the girls who were the rule, the ones who married at 12 or 13. What was it like for them? Well, first off, they were expected to transition from being a daughter under her father's roof to becoming a wife, and ideally, a mother within months of their wedding. There wasn't much of a honeymoon period, just the wedding itself, which could be a lavish affair if the family was wealthy, or a quiet exchange of gifts if they were. The wedding ceremony itself was a blend of ritual and business. The bride would wear a veil, often red, a color associated with both blood, hence fertility, and Aphrodite, the goddess of love. She'd be led to her new home by her father, sometimes while playing a game called Asterisk Onicho, where she carried a jar of wine, symbolizing her transition from girlhood to womanhood. There were songs, dances, and offerings to the gods, Hymenaeus being one of them, the god of weddings, whose name literally means the one who leads the marriage procession. But beneath the poetry, there was also the practical side. The groom would pay a dowry or asterisk pro asterisk, which wasn't always a sum of money, but could include land, livestock, or household goods. This dowry wasn't exactly a gift to the bride. It was more like a deposit, something that if she were divorced, which was rare but not unheard of, she might get back. And if she brought no children into the marriage, well, that wasn't necessarily a deal-breaker in and of itself, though it was certainly less desirable for the husband. Now, let's address the elephant in the room: consent. Did these young brides consent to their marriages? The short answer is not really, at least not in any meaningful way we'd recognize today. A girl might have some influence if she came from a family that valued her opinions, perhaps if she was particularly beautiful, or if she had talents that made her desirable beyond just her fertility. But for the most part, marriage was about family ties, property, and politics. That said, there were stories of brides who resisted, or at least delayed, their marriages. The Spartan women were famously more independent than their Athenian counterparts, and while they still married young, they had more say in choosing their husbands, though this wasn't necessarily about love. It was more about selecting a partner who would secure the best future for her and her children. And then there's the matter of divorce. It existed, but it was rare. A husband could send his wife back to her father's house if she proved barren or otherwise unworthy, but this wasn't something that happened lightly. And if a woman remarried after being divorced, that was even rarer and came with its own social stigma. But let's not forget the boys either. The grooms were often only slightly older than their brides, sometimes just a few years apart. In Athens, men typically married in their late teens or early 20s, so if a bride was 13, her husband might have been 16 or 17. That's not exactly a mature relationship by today's standards, but in the context of ancient Greek society, it made sense. A man in his late teens was old enough to take on the responsibilities of a household and young enough to start a family before he became too set in his ways, or so the logic went. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Greeks wrote about marriage with a certain poetic flair, but they also didn't shy away from its darker sides. Take, for example, the story of Medea. Though she's not Greek by birth, her tale is steeped in Greek mythology and reflects some of the anxieties around marriage, betrayal, and the power, or lack thereof, that women had. And then there's the play Lysistrata Asterisk, where women go on strike to protest war, using their role as wives and mothers as leverage. It's a reminder that even in a society that restricted their freedoms, women still found ways to assert themselves. But let's get back to the age question because, as I'm sure you're wondering, why was this the norm? Why did Greek society prioritize marrying off girls so young? Part of it was practical. In a world with no modern medicine, child mortality rates were high. The longer you waited to have children, the higher the risk that something would go wrong, whether it was miscarriage, stillbirth, or illness in early childhood. By marrying young and starting a family as soon as possible, families increased their chances of having surviving heirs. Another part was economic. A young bride could start producing children immediately, which meant she could contribute to the household's labor force sooner. In a society where women worked alongside men, spinning wool, tending gardens, managing households, there was no reason to wait until a girl was in her 20s to marry her off. And then there was the social pressure. A woman who remained unmarried past her mid-teens was seen as something of an oddity, almost like she had a defect. The idea that she might be past her prime, or too picky, was a common refrain in Greek literature and drama. And let's not forget the role of gods. Hera herself was married off young to Zeus, setting a precedent for other goddesses and mortal women alike. But here's where I have to pause and ask, is this really any different from what we see today? We talk about marrying young in modern terms, but by ancient Greek standards, someone getting married at 25 or 30 would have been seen as an old maid, or, at the very least, someone who was holding out for an impossible standard of love and compatibility. Of course, there were exceptions. Wealthy families might wait longer if they could afford to, and in some cases, women from influential households married later because their marriages served political purposes beyond just producing heirs. But these were the exceptions that proved the rule, not the other way around. Now, let's talk about the legal aspects because, as you might expect, there was no formal age of consent law in ancient Greece. The concept of a minor, someone who wasn't yet an adult, was recognized, but it didn't apply to women in the same way it did to men. A girl could be considered a legal adult for the purposes of marriage long before she would have been allowed to vote or hold office, if she ever could. And if her father was dead, well, then her brother might take over as guardian, and his authority over her would only increase. This brings us to another uncomfortable truth: rape and coercion. We can't ignore the fact that in a society where marriage was often forced, and where a woman's body was seen as property, there were undoubtedly cases of girls being married off against their will or subjected to other forms of abuse. The law might not have protected them, but that doesn't mean they didn't exist. And yet, despite all this, the Greeks also celebrated love and desire in ways that we still admire today. They wrote about eros, passionate, even reckless love, and about philia, the deeper, more enduring bond of friendship. But these ideals were often at odds with the realities of marriage. A man could have affairs, and often did, while a woman's infidelity was seen as a far graver offense, one that could lead to divorce or even death. So where does this leave us? If we're being honest, it leaves us with a rather complicated picture. The Greeks were not the naive romantics we sometimes imagine them to be. They married young because it made sense, economically, socially, and politically. But they also had a rich literary tradition that explored love, desire, and the complexities of human relationships in ways that still resonate today. And perhaps that's the takeaway here. History isn't just about facts and dates. It's about understanding the contradictions, the way societies balance practicality with idealism, power with vulnerability, and progress with tradition. The ancient Greeks were no different from us in that regard. They had their rules, their norms, and their exceptions, but they also had dreams, fears, and a capacity for love that transcended their laws. So as we wrap up this late-night chat, I want to leave you with one thought. The next time you hear about ancient Greek brides, don't just picture them in flowing robes with garlands on their heads. Think about the real girls behind those myths, the ones who were given away at 12, who learned to weave and cook before they could read or write, who carried jars of wine as symbols of their new lives, and who were expected to bear children almost as soon as they'd stopped being children themselves. It's not a pretty picture if you squint too hard, but it is, in its own way, human, and that's what makes history so endlessly fascinating. Good night, dear listeners. Wherever you are tonight, may your thoughts be as quiet and contemplative as the streetlights outside your window. And if you've stuck with me this long,